Memory is supposed to be an anchor. It tells you who you are, where you've been, and what you've done. But sometimes, out here where the roads are long and the distances are measured in silence, memory turns slippery. You start wondering whether you misremember things, or whether the world has quietly rearranged itself when you weren't looking. I used to think identity was simple. A badge, a name, a face in the mirror. Then one case made me question which of those truly belonged to me. Welcome to the Last Witness Files. We upload more interesting videos daily. Please subscribe if this story resonates with you. I've been a tribal police officer for over a decade on a northern reservation where the winters are long and the roads don't mind reminding you who's in charge. My job isn't glamorous. Mostly it's family disputes, DUIs, welfare checks, and the quiet understanding that everyone knows who you are, and you know them too. There's comfort in that familiarity, but there's also a weight to it. Out here, you don't get to be anonymous. Every call has history attached. The call that started all of this came just after dusk in late November. Snow wasn't falling yet, but the sky looked like it wanted to. Dispatch said it was an injured male, found near one of the service roads leading into the old timberland. A passing hunter spotted a body lying just off the tree line. No signs of movement. No vehicle nearby. That kind of thing gets your attention fast. I drove out alone, which isn't unusual around here. We don't always have backup close by, and you learn to work with what you have. The dirt road was a frozen rib cage under the tires. Pines crowded the edges, leaning in like they were trying to listen. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was the quiet. That kind of quiet that isn't peaceful, it's just empty. My headlights swept across the figure lying half on the snow-dusted brush, half on the packed dirt. He was on his side, knees slightly bent, like he'd simply lain down and never got up. I kept my hand near my holster out of habit, then knelt to check for a pulse. His skin was cold. Very cold. There's always a moment in these situations when you shift from maybe to definitely. This man had been dead for hours. I radioed it in, gave coordinates, requested the coroner and state assistants for scene documentation. Protocol. Routine. But while I was talking, my eyes went back to his face. I froze. The man lying there looked like me. Not just similar build or same haircut. I mean the same brow line. Same jaw. Same faint scar through the left eyebrow from when I split it open as a kid falling off a bike. Same lines around the mouth that years of staying quiet tend to carve. Black hair cut short. Same complexion. Same age range. It felt like looking into a mirror that had been dropped into the dirt. For a long minute I didn't say anything. The radio crackled in my hand and I forgot to answer. My breath was visible in front of my face, calm little clouds, like the body and I were breathing together. I told myself the resemblance wasn't that strong. Stress plays tricks. Faces rhyme with each other all the time. People say I look like my cousin, and I barely see it. I forced myself to step back, mentally catalogue what I was seeing like we're trained to do. Male. Native. Mid-30s to early 40s. Approximate height 5'10". Athletic but not bulky. Black winter jacket, generic brand. Dark jeans. Work boots. No wallet visible. No cell phone that I could see. No obvious trauma. No blood. No defensive injuries on the hands. But then there were the details that weren't generic. His left ring finger had a faint white groove where a ring used to be. I have the same faint groove. Divorce does that. His hairline dipped a little lower on the right, exactly like mine. Even the way his shoulders slumped had a familiarity to it, like a posture you recognize from photographs of yourself when you weren't aware the camera was there. I remember saying out loud, softly, "This is ridiculous." As if the trees needed convincing. I waited for backup. I walked the perimeter. I looked for tire tracks, footprints, anything. The ground was cold but not deeply frozen yet, so impressions should have been visible. I found a few partial prints near the brush but nothing that clearly led to him. No sign of a struggle. No drag marks. It was as though he'd been placed there gently, like a child put to bed. When the coroner arrived, followed by a state investigator, I made sure my face was hidden behind a scarf and hat. I didn't want anyone to glance between the body and me and raise an eyebrow. I wasn't sure why. Maybe I didn't want the thought spoken out loud yet. Words make things real. The coroner didn't say anything unusual at first. He took vitals that weren't photos, notes. Body temperature put time of death at some time earlier that afternoon. No visible wounds. Possibly hypothermia, he said, though the clothing didn't suggest a lost hiker. Sometimes people lie down and never get up when the cold gets inside their thinking. It happens. The investigator asked me how I'd found him. I explained the hunter call. Kept my tone neutral. I didn't say, "He looks like me." It felt self-centered somehow, like dragging attention toward a coincidence in the middle of a tragedy. Still, I watched every reaction, waiting for someone else to notice. No one did. Or if they did, they chose to keep quiet. They bagged the body and loaded it gently as the first flakes of snow began to fall. I stood there longer than I needed to, watching the last of the taillights fade into the dark. My breath was steady. My heart, not so much. On the way back, I caught my reflection in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I expected not to see anything there. When I got home late that night, I didn't turn on the TV. I didn't call anyone. I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold fast. I tried to replay the day logically. A man who happened to resemble me had died. That was all. People resemble each other. My rational mind listed off statistics, coincidence probabilities, genetic overlaps in small communities. But underneath all that, something quieter whispered. What if the resemblance wasn't the coincidence? What if I was? I went to bed eventually, but sleep stayed on the other side of the door. And when it finally came, it wasn't the good kind. I reported for shift the next morning like nothing was wrong. Habit is powerful. The station sits near the edge of town, a squat brick building that always smells faintly of burnt coffee and wet boots. The walls inside are covered with old photos, retirements, community events, missing persons bulletins that have yellowed over time but never got taken down. I've passed those walls 1,000 times without really seeing them. That morning, every face felt like it was watching. We had a briefing about the body. No ID yet. Prints pending. Dental if necessary. The coroner said preliminary examination didn't show obvious cause of death. No major internal bleeding, no blunt force trauma, no strangulation signs. Toxicology would take time. Exposure still looked likely. Nobody mentioned the resemblance. I waited for it. I watched eyes bounce from the case notes to each other. But not to me. The silence around that fact started to feel intentional, like a rule we'd all agreed on without saying it out loud. Around noon, I drove out to notify some nearby residences, standard canvassing, see if anyone had seen a man walking near the service road. Out here, you do more listening than talking. People open up slowly. A few folks mentioned a truck they didn't recognize earlier in the week, but nobody remembered seeing our dead man. The forest swallows traffic. You can be 100 feet off the road and basically gone. I stopped at the small diner near the highway and ordered black coffee, pretending I was just grabbing a break. In reality, I was trying to sit still long enough for my thoughts to stop running laps. The waitress, who's known me since I was a kid, refilled my cup and asked if I was working the case. I nodded. She said something about how sad it was, dying alone like that. I agreed. When she turned away, I caught my reflection again in the chrome napkin holder. Same eyebrows. Same tired eyes. The body's face came back to me vividly, and for a moment it didn't feel like a memory. More like a rehearsal. Like I'd been the one lying there, waiting for my own flashlight to find me. That afternoon, the investigator called. They'd run preliminary fingerprints. Still working on confirming, he said, but the database hit is odd. How odd? I asked. There was a pause, like he was deciding how much to say. The prints are extremely close to yours. Not identical, but unusually close. I didn't speak right away. You'd think I'd be prepared for that sentence, but it still felt like the ground tilted half a degree. He went on. Could be a relative. Do you have any brothers? Cousins? Maybe one you don't know well. I told him the truth. My siblings are accounted for. My cousins too. Families around here don't just disappear without everyone knowing. He said they'd keep digging. After the call, I just sat in the cruiser with the engine idling, listening to the heater fan hum. Outside, the day was dimming. This time of year, the sun leaves early, like it doesn't want to be part of whatever's happening down here. I decided to drive back to the site before dark. I told myself it was about thoroughness, making sure we hadn't missed evidence. But there was another reason I didn't say out loud. I wanted to see the place again, without the chaos of responding units. Sometimes locations tell you something when they're quiet. The service road was even lonelier that evening. Snow had crusted over the ground where the body had been. If not for the tire ruts from the coroner's van, you'd never know someone's last moments had ended here. I turned off the engine and stepped out into the cold. The air had that metallic stillness you only get in deep winter. I walked slowly, scanning. The trees were tall silhouettes, their branches webbing together overhead. A single raven watched from a trunk, then lost interest. There was a spot just off the road where the brush flattened slightly. That's where he'd been. I stood there longer than I should have, trying to reconstruct the moment. How did he arrive? Why lie down? Why here? Without really intending to, I pictured myself in that position. Same clothes. Same build. My mind slid into the image like it already knew the shape of it. I forced myself to stop. I walked further into the woods, maybe 50 yards. That was a mistake. The trees look uniform at first, but turn around twice and the landmarks erase themselves. I knew the road was behind me, but it might as well have been a mile away. The silence pressed in, thick, almost physical. The longer you stand in it, the more you start to feel like the world around you isn't empty, it's just waiting. I went back to the cruiser sooner than I needed to. That night, I dreamt of walking out of the forest toward the road and seeing myself leaning against the patrol SUV, arms crossed, studying me calmly. No menace. No surprise. Just observation. When I woke up, the feeling didn't fade. I carried it with me into the next day like a hidden bruise. 2 days later, we got a tentative ID. The man's name, according to a partial match in an out-of-state employment database, was Daniel White. Age 38. No current address on file. A few old addresses scattered across reservations in neighboring states. Nothing serious on his record. Odd jobs. Seasonal work. Then nothing recent. The investigator emailed me the file. I opened it. The photo attached didn't look exactly like me. The nose shape was a little different. The jaw slightly narrower. But if you saw us at the same table, you'd assume we were brothers. Maybe even twins, if you weren't paying attention. I stared at that image so long the screen dimmed and went black. When it did, my own reflection came back instead. For a second, the two faces overlapped, and I couldn't tell which one the world preferred. The strangest part wasn't the resemblance anymore. It was the familiarity. I felt like I'd seen him before. In a store. On a street. Somewhere. But the harder I tried to place it, the more that memory slid away, like trying to grab smoke. I didn't tell anyone about that part. The official line became simple. A drifter with similar features died of exposure near tribal land. Tragic, but not unprecedented. Life goes on. But when something happens that close to your own reflection, life doesn't just go on. It starts watching itself. The funeral came quicker than I expected. Out here, when there's no family stepping forward, arrangements become a quiet compromise between dignity and logistics. The coroner reached out to a few of the addresses tied to Daniel White's name. Letters came back undeliverable. Phone numbers were disconnected. No one claimed the body. So the tribe stepped in. We don't leave people alone at the end if we can help it. It wasn't a large service. A few elders attended. 2 of my colleagues. The coroner, who stood respectfully near the back. The sky was low and grey, pressing down like a ceiling that needed repair. Snow moved in fine, drifting sheets, not enough to sting, just enough to blur the world around the edges. I stood a little off to the side, hands folded in front of me, feeling the resemblance between myself and the man in that coffin grow heavier, like a coat someone else had draped on my shoulders without asking. No one mentioned it. Again. There's a kind of kindness in silence, sometimes. And sometimes there's avoidance. Out here, those 2 things can look the same. After the burial, the elders spoke briefly about respect for the dead, about how no one leaves this world completely unknown. The earth remembers what we forget. I found that both comforting and unsettling. If the earth remembered this man, what did it remember about me? Back at the station, paperwork waited. Death reports don't care about existential unease. They need boxes checked, lines filled, signatures written in precise places. I reviewed the findings so far. Time of death, afternoon to early evening. Cause of death, undetermined, hypothermia suspected. Toxicology, still pending. Trauma, none identified. The investigator had added a note about the fingerprint similarity. Potential familial relation to officer ______, redacted. Further investigation inconclusive. I stared at that line for a long while. Inconclusive. It's a word that sounds neutral, but it isn't. It lingers. It hovers above you like a decision that hasn't been made yet. That evening I drove home along the same stretch of road where he'd been found. I didn't need to, there are faster routes. But I kept choosing that one. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that the world was still predictable. That the forest stayed where it was supposed to be. That the service road didn't lead anywhere except where maps said it did. As I passed the turnoff, my headlights grazed the entrance and I felt, just for a moment, like I should slow down. Like something was unfinished. But I didn't stop. I went home, heated a frozen meal, and listened to the radiator knock like an old man who refuses to leave the porch. It was around midnight when the call came. Another welfare check. Elderly man in one of the outlying houses hadn't been seen for a couple of days. Family worried. I shrugged my jacket back on and headed out. The roads were almost empty at that hour, just the occasional truck carving light through the dark. As I drove, I realized the route would take me past the service road again. The forest looked different at night. The trees absorbed light instead of reflecting it, turning the darkness into something solid. My headlights swept over the turnoff just as before. Only this time, without fully deciding to, I slowed to a crawl. I told myself I was just checking that the barrier tape was still secure. That was partly true. But I also knew I could have kept driving. I rolled to a stop. The tape fluttered slightly in the breeze, a pale strip marking the place where a man who looked like me had lain down and never gotten up. I switched off the engine. The silence that followed was immediate and full. For a moment, I thought I saw someone standing just inside the tree line. A shape. My height. My build. But when I blinked, it was just a trick of shadow and branch. I turned the engine back on and forced myself to keep going. There was work to do, people to check on, real responsibilities. The elderly man turned out to be fine, just stubborn and more reclusive than usual. We exchanged a few dry jokes. He thanked me. I headed back around 2 a.m. The night settled into that deep stillness that only happens when most of the world has surrendered to sleep. That's when I noticed something strange. The fuel gauge. I had filled the tank earlier that day. It should have been near full. Instead, the needle hovered just above half. I frowned. Maybe I'd misremembered. Or maybe the gauge had always been slightly off. But when I got back to the station, I checked the log. Fuel, filled to full at 3:17 p.m. Mileage, consistent with my route. The numbers didn't add up. A small thing. Barely worth noting. But it pressed on my mind like a pebble inside a boot. The next morning, I arrived to find an envelope on my desk. No return address. Inside was a photocopy of an old ID card. It was Daniel White. But the photograph was younger. Clean-shaven. Slightly longer hair. And there, printed clearly, was a birth date. It matched mine. Exactly. Same day. Same year. I looked at it for a very long time, the station noises fading into a dull hum behind me. Phones ringing. Laughter from down the hall. The percolating coffee maker. All of it suddenly distant. When the investigator came by later, I showed him the copy. He frowned. "We don't usually see exact birthday matches in these cases," he said carefully. "Family ties sometimes, sure. But exact. That's statistically low." "Could it be an error?" I asked. "Could be," he said. "Clerical issues happen more than you'd think. But we don't have the original card yet. Just this copy from an employment file. We'll request confirmation." He said it calmly, professionally, but I saw the question in his eyes. "Who is this man to you?" I didn't have an answer. That night I stood in front of the bathroom mirror longer than usual, looking at my face, trying to memorize it. Every line, every shadow, the tiny scar through my eyebrow. I had a sudden, irrational thought. If I don't remember my own face clearly enough, whose face will I think I see tomorrow? I slept with the hallway light on, something I hadn't done since childhood. In the morning, I woke with the distinct feeling that I had forgotten something important. Something just beyond recall. Like a name on the tip of your tongue. I checked my phone. No missed calls. Checked my calendar. No appointments. Still, the feeling stayed. One empty chair at my kitchen table felt wrongfully empty, like it belonged to someone who had just stepped out for a minute and would be back any second. I don't scare easily. The job trims that reflex down to a manageable size. But there was something about this case, about him, that slid past the armor we build around ourselves. And it was only the beginning. The next week settled into a strange rhythm. Outwardly, life went on. Calls came in. Paperwork stacked up. People argued, drank too much, made mistakes, apologized, repeated the cycle. The reservation has its own heartbeat, and it doesn't pause for one nameless burial. But underneath that daily motion, there was a current I couldn't ignore. The state investigator called again. Toxicology came back clean. No drugs. No alcohol beyond negligible trace levels. Heart, lungs, brain, all healthy for a man his age. Exposure was still the best explanation. "Some people just lie down when the cold gets in," he said gently, like he'd said it so many times the words had worn smooth. But this man had clothing. Lead, even. Jacket zipped. Boots laced tight. Most people who lose their way in winter aren't that prepared. We still hadn't located any immediate family. The addresses on file led nowhere. Employers remembered him vaguely, like a coworker from a past life you only recognize when someone else says the name. "Quiet guy," one old boss said. "Did his work. kept to himself. Another said, didn't complain, didn't talk much. I listened to those recordings and couldn't shake the feeling that they might have been talking about me. On my days off, I found myself driving. Not anywhere in particular. Long empty roads with frost blooming across the edges like pale moss. The radio stayed off. I paid too much attention to the gas gauge. Every mile felt accounted for. I kept thinking about that missing fuel and how impossible it was to prove anything now. The numbers were gone, like so many things, erased by the ordinary churn of life. One afternoon, I visited the cemetery. There was no real reason to. His grave was one of the newer mounds, the marker still temporary, a small metal plate with the basics. Name. Year of birth. Year of death. No quotation. No loving inscription. Just a record. The dates hit me again. My birth date. We shared the same calendar entry into the world. I stood there in the half-frozen grass, the wind threading itself through the bare branches overhead. I don't pray much. I don't pretend to know who listens when we talk to the quiet. But I remember saying, barely above a whisper, "Who were you?" The cemetery didn't answer, but something in me shifted. A mild sense of gravity, pulling from somewhere I couldn't name. That night I dreamed again, but differently. In the dream I was sitting in my cruiser, parked on the shoulder of that service road. The world was blue with twilight. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes. In the passenger seat sat me. Same uniform. Same hands folded loosely in his lap. But his face was turned slightly toward the trees, like he was listening to something I couldn't hear. I said, "We should go." He didn't answer. I followed his gaze to the tree line. There was nothing there. Just dark trunks and deeper shadows. When I turned back, the passenger seat was empty. I woke before dawn with a dull ache in my chest, as if I'd spent the night bracing for impact. I arrived early to the station and sat in the parking lot, watching the building breathe itself awake, lights flickering on room by room. I wondered how many cases over the years had slipped into that gray zone of unresolved but not urgent enough to chase. How many quiet mysteries had woven themselves through the place without anyone noticing. Later that morning, the investigator stopped by in person. He handed me a thin folder. "Employment records," he said. "Partial, but more complete than what we had." Inside were copies of intake forms, tax documents, a faded photograph stapled to one page. I studied the writing first. Neat. Unremarkable. But the signature caught me. It wasn't exactly like mine. The slant was a little sharper, yet it had the same rhythm. The same way the last letter trailed off slightly. Then I looked at the listed information. Height, same as mine. Weight, within a few pounds. Eye color, brown. Hair, black. Distinguishing marks, small scar left eyebrow. I pressed my thumb gently over that line, feeling my own scar beneath the skin. Again, could be coincidence, the investigator said, careful. Or he could be an unknown relative. Or? I asked. He hesitated. Or the records are wrong. I nodded. Neither of us said the more uncomfortable possibility, that the records might not be wrong at all, that there simply wasn't a neat box to put this in. After he left, I copied the form and slid the original back into the folder. The copy I folded and placed in my wallet, next to my own ID. The two cards rested against each other like mirror images pressed face to face. That day, something small but important happened. I interviewed a man about a minor vandalism complaint, paint sprayed on a storage shed. Routine. I've talked to the same man a dozen times over the years. But this time, when he opened the door, he blinked in confusion. Then he relaxed. "Oh, it's you," he said. I didn't think much of it until later, when I realized what had bothered me. He looked relieved. Like he'd been expecting someone else who looked like me. "Did someone else come by already?" I asked. He frowned. "Didn't you?" I shook my head. "No." He seemed embarrassed, suddenly unsure. "Must have been my mistake. I'm getting old. Faces blur." We finished the interview, nothing notable. But on the way back to the station, the highway felt longer than usual. I watched the shadows of the trees strobe past the windshield. At one point, without meaning to, I lifted my hand and touched my face, as if checking it was really there. That evening, I went back over old personnel files, my own included. I checked my application date, my academy records, photographs from my first year on the job. I traced the subtle changes in my expression across the years, a little more weight in the eyes, a little less in the smile. Then I pictured Daniel aging alongside me, in parallel. Two lives tracing the same outline on different sides of a map. I wondered where he'd been when I was taking my oath. What he'd been doing the night I pulled my first long shift. Whether he'd ever driven a dark road and felt, deep down, that someone who shared his bones was standing out there, looking back. I kept telling myself to stop thinking that way. But once a thought like that takes root, it grows quietly. The following day brought a new question. Dispatch asked if I could review an old missing persons report from 6 years ago, a man approximately my age, transient, last seen passing through neighboring land. The case didn't go far at the time. He wasn't reported again. No follow-up. The physical description matched Daniel more than it matched me. But just barely. The date he went missing. My birthday. Not the year. The day itself. I don't believe in signs. The job teaches you that patterns are often coincidences we decorate with meaning afterward. But some patterns don't feel decorative. They feel structural. I closed the file slowly, my fingers resting on the paper like it might move if I didn't hold it still. For the first time since the case began, a thought surfaced that I didn't want. What if someone out there knows exactly who he was? And what if they already know who I am? There's a strange thing that happens when you try too hard to ignore something. You don't make it disappear. You only make it quieter. And when something becomes quiet enough, you start hearing it everywhere. That week, my focus began to slip in small, almost undetectable ways. I would reach for a report that wasn't where I thought I'd left it. A sentence on the page would feel unfamiliar, even though I knew I'd written it. Once, I drove past my own driveway without realizing it, only noticing when the landscape outside my window didn't match the mental map of where I was supposed to be. I didn't mention this to anyone. The mind is a traitor when you give it reason to be. One evening I stopped at my mother's house. She lives in a small place near the edge of town, with a stove that clicks when it heats and shelves full of framed photos, family gatherings, school events, moments frozen in time before anyone knew how important they would become just by surviving. We had dinner together. Simple food. Comfortable conversation. At one point, curiosity slipped through my restraint and I asked, gently, did I ever have a twin? Or a brother who didn't make it? She looked up from her plate, surprised. Then she smiled a little and shook her head. No. You came into this world alone. Nearly took your time about it, too. Any chance, I pressed, keeping my tone light, that there was confusion somewhere in the hospital records? Her expression softened in that way that mothers do when they sense something underneath your words. Why are you asking? I hesitated. Then I settled for the safest version of the truth. We found a man. Looks familiar. She nodded slowly. Families around here share features. Blood travels farther than stories do sometimes. We changed the subject. But as I left later that night, I lingered in the hallway by the photo frames. Child versions of me stared back. School portraits. Sports teams. Birthday parties. My face repeated across the years in different clothes and different light, but always unmistakably me. And for a fleeting second, I thought, what if somewhere, on some other wall, another set of frames holds nearly the same images, just a fraction off? The next day at the station, one of the younger officers mentioned something odd in passing. Hey, he said, casual, you been working nights more than usual? No, I said. Why? He shrugged. Probably nothing. Just thought I saw your cruiser near the service road around midnight the other night. Didn't want to bother you if you were on something. I hadn't been. I opened my mouth to correct him but stopped. The explanation sounded too strange inside my own head, and I knew it would sound worse said aloud. Instead I just nodded, like it was an understandable mistake. That evening, I went back to the site again. I told myself it was the last time. Snow had thickened by then, burying the remaining signs that anything unusual had ever happened there. The world had moved on. Only the memory remained, a thin line in my mind I could trace with my thoughts but not erase. I stood by the tree line, hands in my jacket pockets, breath dragging little clouds into the cold air. My cruiser idled nearby, headlights pointing down the empty service road like they were searching for something that wasn't going to return. I thought about how often people vanish, not just physically, but from records, from conversations, from the version of the world that other people acknowledge. How easy it is to slide into the margins until even your face doesn't belong to anyone anymore. I wondered if Daniel had felt that way. And then a new thought came, unsettling and uninvited. What if I have? On the way back, I drove slower than usual. The highway was a ribbon of dark glass, the snowlight smoothing everything into a muted calm. At one point, I noticed a faint glow in the mirror, headlights in the distance, approaching gradually. Nothing remarkable. But as the vehicle drew closer, an odd familiarity crept in. Same headlight pattern. Same roof bars. Same silhouette. A cruiser. I checked the clock. The other patrol officer on duty that night was assigned to the opposite sector. We rarely crossed routes unless something required it. The cruiser came closer. Closer. For a moment, our lanes ran parallel. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see. Behind the wheel sat a man in uniform. My uniform. His profile was visible for only a second, a slice of face lit by the dashboard, but it was enough. The line of the jaw. The curve of the cheek. The scar through the eyebrow. He didn't look at me. He didn't react at all. He simply drove on, steady, like a man following a route he'd taken 100 times. My grip tightened on the steering wheel. I glanced back at the road to keep from drifting. When I looked again, the cruiser had already slipped ahead, swallowed by the dark. I didn't chase it. I just drove home and sat in my car for a long time in the driveway, engine off, the ticking metal cooling in the quiet. There are explanations for everything, we're told. Another officer. A reflection. A trick of angle and shadow. Our eyes fill in gaps. Our minds complete shapes that aren't really there. I repeated those explanations like prayers. But the next morning, there was a note on my locker. No name. No greeting. Just a single line, written in neat, careful handwriting. Do you remember which one you are? I stared at the paper until the letters stopped feeling like language and turned into abstract little black marks. I folded it once, then again, and slipped it into my pocket. I didn't show anyone. Later that day, I requested copies of radio logs from the past 2 weeks. Officially, I was just reviewing procedural coverage. Unofficially, I was looking for myself. There were entries that didn't make sense. Unit numbers close to mine signing on and off at odd hours. Short transmissions acknowledging calls I knew I hadn't taken. Times that overlapped with reports I'd already filed. Nothing flagrant. Nothing blatantly wrong. Just doubled. Like the paper itself had developed a shadow. I closed the binder carefully and sat there at my desk, listening to the low hum of fluorescent lights, the shuffle of boots in the hall, the ordinary life of the station continuing as if reality had no reason to doubt itself. That evening, when I looked in the mirror, there was a moment, a fraction of a second, barely measurable, when my reflection didn't feel like me. Not wrong. Just independent. Like it had its own memory I wasn't part of. I touched the glass. Cold. I waited for my reflection to lag behind. It didn't. But the idea had already taken root, and it followed me back into sleep. In the dream, I was walking a long, empty hallway in a building without windows. My footsteps echoed softly. At the far end, a man in uniform stood with his back to me. I called out. He didn't move. When I reached him, he finally turned. It was me. But the look in his eyes told me something I didn't want to understand. He wasn't the copy. He thought I was. I woke before he could speak. And I wasn't sure which of us had opened our eyes. I started carrying the note with me everywhere. Folded small, tucked behind my ID. Not because I wanted to look at it, but because I didn't trust where it might end up if I didn't. That single sentence felt like a quiet accusation pressed flat between layers of plastic and paper. Do you remember which one you are? Most days, I tried to lose myself in routine. Respond to calls. Write reports. Drink terrible coffee that tasted like old metal and stale air. But even routine felt unstable now, like the floor might flex slightly under my step if I stopped paying attention. People started greeting me twice. A shop owner would nod as I walked in and say, "Back again." Or someone at the station would mention a conversation I didn't remember having. None of it was big enough to challenge directly. Just off by a few degrees. Enough to make me feel like I was sliding out of sync with the place I'd always belonged to. One night, I stayed late finishing paperwork. The building was mostly empty. Old fluorescent lights hummed overhead, their faint flicker giving the illusion that the walls were breathing. I gathered my things and walked down the corridor toward the exit. Halfway there, I stopped. Voices. Not loud. Just low conversation coming from one of the side rooms, the small interview office we rarely used at night. The door was nearly closed, a thin band of light bleeding out across the hall floor. I shouldn't have listened. But curiosity is a quiet predator. It doesn't pounce. It waits until you lean close on your own. I stepped carefully, my boots silent against the linoleum. At first, I only heard one voice. Calm. Tired. Familiar. My voice. "I don't think he knows yet," it said. Silence followed. Then another voice answered, one I couldn't place. Soft. Almost sympathetic. How long can that hold? My voice again. As long as it needs to. I stood there with my hand hovering near the doorknob, not quite touching it. My throat felt dry. My heart should have been racing, but it wasn't. It was steady. Measured. Like it didn't see a reason to panic. I forced myself to push the door open. The room was empty. Lights on. Chairs in place. Table undisturbed. No one. The air still felt faintly warm. I stayed there longer than I needed to, staring at the vacant chairs like they might fill themselves again if I blinked too long. But nothing happened. Eventually, I switched off the light and went home. That night, I didn't dream. Instead, I woke around 3 a.m. to the sound of a car idling outside my house. I lay there for a moment, listening. Yes. An engine. Low. Patient. I got up, moved quietly to the front window, and parted the curtain. A cruiser sat across the street. Not moving. Headlights off. Only the faint glow of the dashboard. I couldn't see the driver clearly from that angle. Just a shape. A silhouette that might have been anyone, except I already knew what my gut believed. I considered going outside. But some instincts are older than logic. So I stood there, watching, until the engine finally cut out and the darkness folded back in like water around a stone. The cruiser was gone by morning. I tried to convince myself it belonged to another officer on patrol, taking a break. Happens all the time. But when I checked the logs later, there was no record of a unit being anywhere near my street overnight. Could be a logging error, the dispatcher said when I asked, casually, as if I wasn't really asking anything at all. Yes. Could be. Everything could be. Around that time, I noticed something else. The photograph on my ID badge, the one clipped to my uniform each shift, didn't look quite right. Objectively, it was the same picture taken during my last renewal. But the angle of the eyebrows seemed slightly different. The faint line around the mouth deeper. Or shallower. I couldn't decide. I chalked it up to fatigue. Overthinking. Projection. Until the day I placed my ID next to the copy of Daniel's employment card. Side by side, the photos almost aligned. Almost. It was like comparing two maps of the same terrain made by different surveyors years apart. Same mountains. Same rivers. Slightly shifted borders. I shut the wallet and put it away. There are moments in life when you realize that asking more questions won't bring clarity, only a sharper form of confusion. The truth doesn't always arrive as a gift. Sometimes it shows up like a slow leak. A few evenings later, I responded to a call about a stalled vehicle on the reservation border highway. A simple assistance call. The kind that rarely turns into anything more dramatic than a thank you and a handshake. By the time I arrived, the car was gone. No sign of skid marks. No debris. No footprints in the snow near the shoulder. I radioed back. Dispatch confirmed the caller had given precise coordinates. Verified twice. I turned off the cruiser for a moment and sat there with the engine ticking in the cold. The sky was enormous. The road stretched in both directions like a line drawn across an empty page. In the distance, lights from a distant house flickered. That was all. And for the first time in my career, I had the sensation, not the thought, but the sensation, that I wasn't the only version of myself answering calls out here. That maybe somewhere else along these roads, another me had already arrived, already knocked on the window of that stalled car, already spoken words I would never remember saying. On the way back, I passed a reflective road sign. For a moment, the cruiser headlights bounced back and lit my face in the glass of the side window. Except, it took me a second longer than it should have to recognize myself. That hesitation scared me more than anything else had. Back at home, I sat at the kitchen table with the lights off, listening to the refrigerator cycle, the house adjusting to the temperature drop, the faint hum of the world still operating around me. I thought about identity. How delicate it really is. We pretend it's fixed. We embed it in documents and photographs and names spoken out loud. But underneath all that paper and language, there's just memory. A set of stories we quietly repeat to ourselves until they feel permanent. What happens when the story starts repeating wrong? What happens when the echo doesn't line up with the original sound? I didn't come to any conclusions. I'm not sure I even wanted to. I just sat there until the sky outside shifted from black to gray and the world pretended to begin again. When my shift started that morning, I pinned my badge to my uniform like always. It shone the way it always had. But when I caught my reflection in the station window, there was something in my expression that hadn't been there before. Not fear. Not confusion. Recognition. Like I'd finally realized that I wasn't just investigating a case. I was part of it. And I didn't know which side of the report my name belonged on.
There's a saying among officers, if you stare at the same case long enough, it starts staring back. I'd always thought that was a metaphor. Something older cops said over bad coffee, half joking, half warning. But by the time the 7th week rolled around, the case didn't feel like something I was looking at anymore. It felt like something that was looking for me. We received the final medical examiner's report that Monday. I read it slowly, line by line, waiting for something definitive. Some sharp edge of fact I could grip with both hands. But the words moved past quietly, like water over stone. Cause of death, hypothermia. Manner of death, undetermined. Not accidental. Not self-inflicted. Not homicide. Just, undetermined. There's a particular chill that comes from that word. It's not the cold of winter. It's the cold of realizing that the world isn't obligated to provide answers, no matter how calmly you keep asking. The investigator stopped by later with a small cardboard box. Daniel's personal effects. Nothing much, a cheap watch, cracked along the band. A pocket knife worn smooth with use. A single key on a ring with no tag. A folded paper receipt from a gas station 2 towns over. I picked up the watch first. It was generic, something you'd find behind glass in a discount store. But when I turned it over, my breath caught. The back plate had an inscription, etched in faint, almost hesitant lettering. DW, don't forget who you are. I don't know how long I stood there reading that sentence. The room around me felt like it had stepped a few inches to the left. I realized the investigator was watching me carefully, the way people do when they're not sure whether to speak. "Everything okay?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just familiar." I didn't elaborate. He didn't press. Later, alone in my office, I held that watch in my palm, feeling the small weight of it, the way metal remembers touch long after the hand has gone. I checked the time. The battery had died sometime before the body was found. The hands were frozen at 4:17. I thought about the fuel gauge again. About missing time. About things that don't add up when they should. I slipped the watch into my pocket, meaning to log it back properly later. That evening, as I left the station, I noticed my cruiser wasn't where I'd parked it. Same lot. Same row. Just 2 spaces down from the place I remembered leaving it that morning. Memory is fallible. I know that. Stress blurs edges. But I have habits carved deep by repetition, and one of them is parking in the same general area every shift. I unlocked the door and slid into the driver's seat, but something didn't feel right. The seat adjustment was slightly off. Too close to the wheel. The radio volume lower than I usually keep it. A faint smell of winter air inside, like a window had been cracked open recently. Everything subtle. Everything deniable. I checked the mileage. It matched the log. Exactly. I stared at the numbers until they blurred. On the way home, I drove the long way, out past the reservation border and across the quiet stretches of road that most people only use as shortcuts when the main highway gets clogged. The world outside the windshield felt thin, like scenery in a play, waiting for direction. Eventually, I pulled onto a turnout and stopped. The sky was clear, a rare break in the winter cloud cover, and the stars looked sharp enough to cut your hand on. I killed the engine and stepped out. Silence. Not empty silence. Full silence. The kind that feels like it's listening. I stood there and asked myself a question I hadn't dared put into words before. If another version of me exists out here, one following similar roads, answering similar calls, how would I ever prove which version is the original? And who would decide? The darkness didn't answer. But as I turned to get back into the cruiser, something caught my eye. Boot prints. My boot prints. Not surprising at first. I'd just stepped out of the car. But these prints weren't fresh. The snow inside them had hardened, crusted over. They led from the turnout toward the tree line and disappeared into the forest. I crouched down and studied them. Same tread. Same wear pattern. Same slight outward turn on the left foot I'd developed after an old ankle injury. But I hadn't been here before. At least, not that I remembered. I followed the tracks a few yards into the trees, my flashlight beam cutting white through the darkness. The forest swallowed sound like a sponge. Each breath felt louder than it should have. The trail ended at a small clearing. Nothing special. Just a ring of bare earth where the snow hadn't stuck, as though the ground there remembered warmth longer than everywhere else. I turned slowly, scanning. No signs of a camp. No trash. No scorch marks. Just the stillness of a place that had been waiting a long time. Then I noticed something I'd missed at first. A faint indentation in the snow. Human-shaped. As if someone had lain down there, just long enough to leave an impression, then stood up and vanished. I didn't go any further. I walked back to the cruiser, got in, locked the doors, and sat very still, my hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as if I was afraid to grip too tightly in case the world shattered around the pressure. On the drive home, I kept glancing at the passenger seat, half expecting to find someone sitting there, not hostile, not surprised, just present. When I reached my house, the front porch light flickered. It does that sometimes in the cold, but that night it felt like hesitation. Like the house itself wasn't sure who was walking up the steps. Inside, I set the watch on the kitchen table, next to my own. 2 timepieces. 2 frozen moments. 1 still ticking. 1 trapped in an instant. I lined them up so the faces touched. The glass reflected each other. I don't know how long I stood there. Eventually I went to bed, though the word sleep doesn't really apply to what followed. It was more like drifting, hovering somewhere between waking and dreaming, where your thoughts move on rails you didn't build. At some point, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Measured. Familiar. They stopped outside my bedroom door. I waited for a knock. It never came. The next morning, there were no prints in the thin layer of dust by the baseboard. No sign anyone had been there. But the sensation of being counted, of being compared against something unseen, stayed with me long after the sun rose. That day at work, I didn't request any more files. I didn't check any more logs. I answered calls. I filled out reports. I pretended the world was stable. But each time I caught my reflection in a window, I felt the same subtle distance. Like the man looking back was doing the same thing I was. Pretending. And between us, somewhere in the space where memory becomes identity, something patient and careful was keeping score.
I didn't tell anyone about the clearing. There are some details you keep back, not because you're hiding something, but because you don't want to hear them spoken out loud. Words have edges. Once something is described, it becomes real in a way that's hard to undo. Instead, I tried to anchor myself to small certainties. My badge still carried my name. My uniform still fit. My mother still called me by the same childhood nickname when she forgot I was an adult. But certainty, I was learning, has seams. A few days later, I was assigned to assist with a search for a missing teenager who hadn't returned home after visiting friends on the far side of the reservation. These searches are delicate. Fear builds quietly in families, like water filling a glass. You do your best to keep your voice calm. We formed a small team and began canvassing the usual routes, back roads, dirt tracks, shortcuts kids take because shortcuts feel like independence. I was paired with a state officer I'd worked with a few times before. Good man. Practical. The kind of calm that's contagious. We drove in silence for a while. Then he said, casually, "Didn't expect to see you again so soon." I glanced over. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "Thought you were working nights now. We ran into each other a couple times last week. You looked tired." I kept my eyes on the road. "I wasn't out this way last week." He frowned. "Huh. Must have been someone who looks like you." "Maybe." But his tone had shifted. Small. Uncertain. As if he was replaying those encounters in his head and finding that the details didn't sit quite right. We didn't talk much after that. The teenager turned up later that evening, at a relative's place, embarrassed but fine. Relief passed through the community like a gentle thaw. We went home. Case closed. Except nothing really closes when your own life feels open at the seams. That night, sleep didn't come quietly. I hovered for a while at the edge of it, then slipped into a dream so ordinary it took me a moment to realize it was one. I was sitting at my kitchen table. Across from me sat me. Not a twisted reflection. Not a nightmare version. Just me. Same jacket. Same haircut. Same faint lines near the eyes. We didn't speak. We just sat there, looking at each other like strangers on a long bus ride who recognize something familiar but can't place it. His expression was calm. Mine, I suppose, was too. Then I noticed the watches. He wore Daniel's watch. I wore mine. Both ticking. We lifted our wrists at the same time, synchronized without agreement. 4:17. I woke abruptly, the echo of that number lingering in my mind like a half-remembered address. I went to the kitchen. Both watches were still on the table. One ticking. One frozen. No movement. No second hand shifting. Just silence. I made coffee and sat there in the dim morning light, waiting for the day to decide what it wanted to be. At the station, a memo had been posted on the board. Nothing unusual. Procedural updates, scheduling notes, reminders. But near the bottom, in neat handwriting, someone had added a small line. Officers are reminded to confirm identity when interacting with units after dark. I stared at it for a long time. Identity. As if it was something you could check the way you check license plates. A colleague noticed me reading. "Yeah," he said lightly, Someone upstate has been pranking with fake unit decals. Probably nothing. Probably nothing. So many things become probably nothing when the alternative is too strange to fit into policy. That afternoon, I went to visit the cemetery again. There were tracks in the thin snow near Daniel's grave. Not unusual. People pass through. The ground remembers footsteps and then forgets them again. But these prints didn't lead away. They circled the grave once, then stopped. As if the person who made them had stood there for a quiet, patient amount of time before leaving by some path the snow didn't record. I looked down at my boots. Same tread. Same wear. The wind picked up, smoothing the edges of the prints like an eraser moving slowly across a page. On the way back to the cruiser, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I answered. For a second, all I heard was the faint hiss of an open line. Then, "I'm sorry." My own voice. Calm. Quiet. Then the line went dead. I stood there with the phone pressed to my ear long after the call ended, the cold creeping into my fingers through the thin gloves. Eventually, I checked the call log. No record. As if the phone itself had decided it didn't want to remember. That evening, I drove out to the service road one last time. At least, that's what I told myself. The barrier tape was gone now. Case closed. World restored. The forest, indifferent as always, waited. I turned off the headlights and let the darkness settle in. The shapes of the trees emerged slowly, the way truth does when you stop trying to drag it into the light. For a long while, nothing happened. Then, faintly, as if carried from somewhere far down the road, I heard the sound of an engine. Not loud. Not rushing. Just arriving. Headlights bloomed in the distance, tracing the bends of the service road like careful handwriting. A cruiser. I recognized the pattern instantly. Red-blue reflection glancing off the wet bark of trees. It slowed. Stopped a short distance behind me. I watched the mirror. The driver's door opened. A figure stepped out. Uniform. Winter jacket. The familiar tilt of the shoulders. He lifted a flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark and painting the ground in pale white. Then the light touched my rear bumper. Paused. Traveled up the window. For a heartbeat, our eyes met through the glass. My face. Older. Calmer. I couldn't tell. Neither of us moved. The forest didn't move. Even the snow seemed to hold still in the air. Eventually, he lowered the flashlight, gave a small nod, not acknowledgement, exactly. More like recognition of a fact neither of us felt ready to say aloud. Then he turned, walked back to his cruiser, and drove away, the taillights shrinking into the deeper dark until they were gone. I didn't follow. I didn't call it in. I just sat there, listening to my own breathing, and wondered how many roads one life could travel at the same time. And whether, somewhere along the way, I'd stepped onto the wrong one without noticing. That night, before I went to bed, I placed Daniel's watch on my wrist. It didn't tick. But I wore it anyway. Not as a keepsake. Not as a reminder. Just as a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes the boundary between who we are and who we could have been is thinner than we'd like to admit. And that in the cold, under certain conditions, two lives can leave the same footprints. Wearing Daniel's watch changed something, though I couldn't have explained what. It wasn't superstition. It wasn't sentiment. It was more like an alignment. Two lines on a map being quietly overlaid until they nearly matched. I went to work. I answered calls. I gave statements. I didn't mention the other cruiser. There are experiences you learn not to submit into official channels because the paperwork can't hold their weight without bending. The watch sat loose on my wrist, the metal cold at first, then warming slowly, patiently, as if it were waiting for body heat to decide which pulse belonged to it. The hand still pointed to 4:17. Frozen. A trapped second. I didn't try to wind it. I just let it be what it was. Midweek brought a call out to a minor accident on the highway, a car that had slid slightly into a ditch but hadn't rolled. The driver was shaken but fine. I took statements, directed a tow, let the routine wrap around me like a blanket. As I finished up, an older woman in the vehicle leaned out and said softly, "Didn't think I'd see you twice this week." I paused. "Twice?" She nodded. "You helped me Sunday. I had a flat outside town. I had been off duty Sunday." I smiled politely, the automatic, easy one I keep for reassuring people, and said, "Glad you got it sorted." Later, alone in the cruiser, I stared at the empty road and tried to remember being somewhere I hadn't been. The memory didn't come. But the sensation of déjà vu did, not the sudden rush of familiarity, but its quieter cousin, the awareness that something in the world already accounted for me being here once. When your identity becomes porous, time follows. That evening, I stopped by the station late to drop off some finalized reports. The building after hours feels like a held breath, the hum of vents, the tick of old baseboards, the tired endurance of a place that never truly sleeps. I walked past the glass case of historic photos by the front entrance, old chiefs, early officers, community leaders. My eye caught a face I'd never noticed before. Black and white. Uniform. A man whose features echoed mine, faintly, like a memory cast forward through bloodlines. The caption was worn, but I could still read it. Officer David White, Tribal Police, 1973 to 1982. White. Not Daniel. But close enough for the mind to start building bridges. I traced the letters with my gaze, studying the man's expression. There was a heaviness in his eyes I recognized, the weight of someone who knows that the land remembers more than people do. I moved on, but the name followed me. White. Common enough. Ordinary. Easy to dismiss. Except nothing about this case had stayed ordinary for long. A couple of days later, the state investigator called to inform me that the effort to locate verified family for Daniel was being deprioritized, his word, not mine. It happens when leads dry up and the world keeps spinning. Files slide gently into archives. The past grows heavier, but quieter. He hesitated before ending the call. "I've been doing this job a long time," he said. "Most cases, even the strange ones, eventually give up something. This one," he stopped. "This one doesn't behave." I thanked him. We hung up. The line clicked into silence. For the first time, it occurred to me that he might also be seeing edges where edges shouldn't be. That evening I went for a walk. No cruiser, no uniform. Just boots crunching through old snow, hands tucked deep into my jacket pockets. I walked through the small residential streets of town, past houses I knew by heart. A porch light here. A cracked step there. Windows like tired eyes. Every so often, I'd catch a reflection of myself in a darkened pane. Most times, it looked right. Once or twice, it didn't. Nothing dramatic. No lag. No distortion. Just a subtle misalignment, like two images not quite synchronized. I kept walking until I found myself near the boundary where the town thins and the land opens out into something older. The sky was low, clouds dragging their bellies across the horizon. A faint moon traced its way through them. There's a place out there, not a landmark exactly, just a widening of the world, where you can hear the wind change voices. It moves through the grass differently, through the trees differently, through you differently. I stood there for a while, listening. A thought came to me. Not loud. Not frightening. Just present. If I disappear one day, will anyone know which version of me they've lost? I rolled that thought over slowly, like a stone in my palm. On the walk back, the streets looked slightly unfamiliar, like someone had repainted the lines of my life a shade too bright. At home, I placed the watch on the table again, next to mine. I sat across from them like they were witnesses. My watch ticked. Daniel's did not. But the frozen second at 4:17 had begun to feel less like a stopped moment and more like a crossroads. A quiet intersection where two lives overlapped long enough to recognize each other, and then kept going. The phone rang. I answered without checking the number. Silence. Then, "Do you remember now?" Not accusatory. Not threatening. Just concerned. My voice. Older. Younger. Parallel. I didn't answer. The line stayed open a while, the sound of distant wind whispering through it. Then it clicked off. I set the receiver down gently. There's a point in any investigation where you realize that the questions you're asking are no longer about the case, they're about you. A line is crossed quietly, almost politely. You don't notice until you're standing on the other side. I thought about the cemetery, the tracks around the grave, the circled path, the absence of exit prints. I thought about the other cruiser, the headlights, the nod. I thought about the note. Do you remember which one you are? The next day, I requested a few days off. I told the chief I needed rest. He agreed. Said I'd been carrying more than my share lately. His hand rested on my shoulder an extra second longer than usual, like he wanted to say something else but decided not to. Rest. I drove out beyond the edge of town, past the service road, past the last scattering of houses. The world opened up into a wide quiet that felt honest. I parked, switched off the engine, and stepped out. Snow creaked under my boots. Clouds shifted. The land breathed. I closed my eyes. For a moment, just a moment, I felt like two memories overlapping. One of a man standing alone in the cold, and one of a man, somewhere not far away, watching him. When I opened my eyes, the world was still there. The sky was still heavy. The air still held that faint metallic taste of winter. Nothing supernatural had arrived to explain anything. No revelation. No answer. Just the steady, indifferent reality of a world that doesn't stop to clarify itself. I walked a little way toward the tree line, not far, just enough to feel the shift in sound. I thought of what the elders had said at the funeral, that the earth remembers what we forget. I wondered what the earth remembered about us, about men whose faces rhyme with each other across time and chance. As the light faded, I headed back to the cruiser. I checked the time. My watch read 6:42. Daniel's watch, silent on my wrist, still said 4:17. And for reasons I can't fully explain. That felt like the truest fact in my life. I didn't plan for there to be a last time. Endings rarely announce themselves. They arrive disguised as ordinary days, waiting for you to step into them before they reveal what they are. I woke early. No alarm. Just the slow awareness of morning easing itself into the room. For once, my thoughts weren't racing ahead of me. They moved calmly, like a river that decided it no longer needed to argue with its banks. I brewed coffee. Sat at the table. 2 watches on the wood surface in front of me. Mine. And his. 4:17. I traced the minute hand lightly with a fingertip. I didn't feel afraid. Just steady. The sky outside looked pale and unfinished, like it hadn't decided on a color yet. I put on my uniform without really questioning why. Habit, maybe. Or maybe some part of me knew it mattered to meet the day as the person I'd been all this time. On the way out, I paused at the mirror. I studied my reflection with the same quiet curiosity I might give to a stranger. Same eyes. Same scar. Same life, laid gently into lines and small tired shadows. I nodded once, not to reassure myself, not to pretend, just a simple acknowledgement. You are here. For now. I drove without a destination. Roads branched. I chose the one that felt familiar in a way that didn't need justification. The reservation passed by in slow frames. Houses. Trees. Open land. Sky. All the constants that had shaped the quiet boundaries of my world. Eventually, inevitably, the road narrowed. Forest gathered close. The service road appeared like a sentence I'd read too many times. I turned in. Snow whispered under the tires. The air carried the faint metallic tang of cold earth. I parked where I'd parked before and stepped out into the stillness. There's a kind of silence the world only gives you when it knows you'll treat it gently. That silence was waiting. I walked toward the place where the trees let the road go. The spot where we'd found him. The place where the earth had held the outline of a man long enough for others to see it. No markers remained now. Snow had rewritten the page. The world looked untroubled. Almost innocent. I stood there with my hands in my jacket pockets, feeling the weight of the watch on my wrist. 4:17. There are moments when you realize you've reached the end of the questions. Not because you found the answers, but because continuing to ask would only circle back to the same quiet place. I thought about Daniel. If that was his name. About the inscription on the watch. Don't forget who you are. I thought about the other cruiser. The other me. The nod shared on a road where no one else was meant to be watching. I thought about all the small misalignments, the fuel gauge, the radio logs, the faces that greeted me twice. Whether those were mistakes, stress, fading memory, or simply reality showing seams it never meant to hide. And standing there, I understood something without needing proof. Some lives echo. They don't copy. They rhyme. Perhaps we had taken different turns on the same long road. Perhaps the earth had only brought those roads close enough, once, for our shadows to overlap. I don't know. I won't pretend to. At some point, I became aware of another sound. Footsteps. Measured. Deliberate. Approaching along the road behind me. I didn't turn right away. I let the sound arrive on its own terms. When I finally did, he was there. Not a stranger. Not a monster wearing my face. Just a man. Older lines. Slightly different posture. Same uniform, worn in a way that felt lived in. Same eyes, carrying the same weight. We stood a few yards apart, the cold tracing soft white ghosts from our breath. No weapons. No hostility. No fear. Just recognition. He lifted his wrist slightly. A small, almost absent gesture. The watch. 4:17. I did the same. For a long moment, we just existed in the same place. Not mirrored. Not duplicated. Shared. I opened my mouth, though I didn't know what I meant to say. But nothing came. Words didn't belong here. After a while, he gave the same small nod I remembered from the road. It wasn't farewell. It wasn't greeting. It was acknowledgement of a truth too quiet for language. We are both real. We are both here. And that is enough. He turned, walked back toward his cruiser, and faded into the trees, not like vanishing, not like magic, just the ordinary way distance swallows people when they keep walking. I remained where I was. Listening. Remembering. Not trying to solve anything anymore. Eventually, the cold reached my bones the way winter always does. I returned to the car. Sat there for a minute. Watched the frost creep in gentle patterns across the glass. Then I started the engine and drove back toward town. The world continued as it always had. Calls. Routine. Faces. Paperwork. Quiet kindness. Trouble that arrives uninvited and leaves slowly. Life didn't change because something strange had happened to me. I changed because I learned to live with the part of reality that doesn't always raise its hand to be counted. Sometimes, when the nights are long and the roads are empty, I glance at the passenger seat. I don't expect to see anyone there. Most of the time, I don't. But every now and then, I have the faint sense that I'm being accompanied, not followed, not haunted, just accompanied. By a life that might have been mine. By a man who shares my name, or doesn't. By a version of the world that runs quietly alongside this one, close enough to notice, far enough to remain polite. Before bed, I set both watches on the table. Mine still counts the seconds I get to keep. His remains at 4:17. A reminder that time doesn't always move in straight lines. And that identity, like winterlight, can be both clear and fragile. I don't need to decide which one of us was the original. I don't think the world works that way. I just need to keep showing up. Doing the job. Being whoever I am, in the place that still calls me by name. And when I stand sometimes at the edge of the forest, listening to the wind move through the trees, I swear, I can almost hear another set of boots in the snow, walking their own path, right beside mine. Not ahead, not behind, just parallel, quiet, present, real.